War is often told as a story of men, armies marching, generals commanding, soldiers charging across frozen fields and burning cities. But on the Eastern Front of World War II, the largest and deadliest theater of war in human history, something happened that surprised even the soldiers fighting there. Women went to war. Not as nurses, not as factory workers, not only as support personnel. They went as snipers, as fighter pilots, as machine gunners, as tank drivers, as frontline soldiers. By the end of the war, nearly 800,000 women had served in the Soviet armed forces. This was not symbolic participation. It was not limited to rear positions. Thousands of them fought at the front, and many died there. To understand why this happened, we need to understand the scale of the crisis the Soviet Union faced in 1941. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it was the largest invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. Within months, entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands were captured. Millions would die in the first year alone. The Red Army was collapsing under the force of the assault. The Soviet Union faced an existential threat. And when a state faces extinction, it begins to use every resource it has, including women. But this was not entirely spontaneous. Even before the war, Soviet ideology promoted the idea, at least officially, that women were equal participants in building socialism. Women drove tractors, worked in heavy industry, trained in paramilitary organizations. Shooting clubs and aviation schools were open to young women. The concept of a woman handling a rifle was not entirely alien in Soviet culture. When Germany invaded, thousands of young women volunteered immediately. Some were rejected. Some were told to serve as nurses. But as losses mounted in 1941 and 1942, the need became undeniable. The Red Army began forming female units, and some of those units would become legendary. One of the most remarkable phenomena was the rise of Soviet female snipers. Sniping on the Eastern Front was not a side activity. It was a core tactical component of infantry warfare. The vast front lines, ruined cities, forests, and trenches created ideal conditions for trained marksmen. Soviet commanders quickly realized something. Women often made exceptional snipers. They tended to be patient, meticulous, calm under pressure, less likely to take unnecessary risks. Training was brutal and rigorous. Sniper schools demanded physical endurance, camouflage mastery, and psychological resilience. Students crawled for hours through mud and snow. They learned to remain motionless for entire days. They studied ballistics and wind correction. Among them was Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She would become one of the deadliest snipers in history. By the end of the war, Pavlichenko was credited with 309 confirmed kills, including dozens of enemy snipers. But numbers only tell part of the story. She fought in Odessa, then in Sevastopol. She was wounded multiple times. Each time, she returned to combat. In 1942, she was sent to the United States as part of a Soviet delegation. American journalists did not know how to treat her. Some asked her about makeup, others about her skirt length. She responded bluntly, "I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The quote circulated widely. For Americans in 1942, the idea of a woman sniper with hundreds of confirmed kills was almost incomprehensible. In the U.S. military at that time, women were not assigned combat roles. They served in auxiliary positions, clerical work, communications, nursing, ferrying aircraft. The Soviet Union had crossed a line that America had not. But snipers were only part of the story. In 1941, famed aviator Marina Raskova petitioned Stalin directly to form all-female aviation regiments. Stalin agreed. 3 regiments were formed. 1 flew fighters, 1 flew dive bombers, and 1 flew outdated Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes in night bombing missions. It was this last unit that would become known to the Germans as the Night Witches. They flew slow wooden biplanes originally designed for crop dusting and training. Their aircraft were vulnerable, underpowered, and lacked radar. But they adapted. Flying at night, they would cut their engines near the target and glide silently before dropping bombs. German soldiers reported hearing only a faint whooshing sound before explosions. The sound reminded them of a witch's broom. The name stuck. These women flew thousands of missions. Some flew over 800 sorties. They navigated in darkness, under anti-aircraft fire, in freezing temperatures, often with minimal instruments. The casualty rate was high. They were not symbolic. They were lethal. And then there were women who served in armored units, not in large numbers, but enough to matter. Some became tank drivers, some mechanics under fire, some machine gunners inside steel hulls rolling toward Berlin. The environment inside a tank was brutal. Extreme heat in summer, freezing steel in winter, deafening noise, constant concussion from shell impacts. War does not soften itself for gender. Many of these women were teenagers when they enlisted. Some lied about their age. Some lost entire families in the invasion. Motivation was rarely ideological abstraction. It was personal. Villages burned. Parents killed. Cities starved. The siege of Leningrad alone killed over 1 million civilians. For many Soviet women, the war was not about global strategy. It was about survival. But the story is not romantic. The Red Army was harsh. Discipline was severe. Penal battalions existed. Order number 227, not one step back, reflected the desperation of 1942. Female soldiers were not exempt from hardship. They endured freezing marches, artillery barrages, hunger, and psychological trauma. After the war, their recognition was complicated. During the war, propaganda celebrated them. After the war, many were expected to return quietly to civilian life. Some found it difficult to marry. Some concealed their combat history. Some struggled with trauma in a society that did not use that word. And yet, their contribution was undeniable. By 1945, women had earned dozens of Hero of the Soviet Union awards, the country's highest honor. They had fought in Stalingrad, in Kursk, in Berlin. For American audiences, this history challenges assumptions. When Americans think of women in World War II, they often think of Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of industrial mobilization. They think of nurses near the front. They think of ferry pilots in the WASP program. But they do not usually think of women in trenches with rifles. The Soviet experience forces a question. Was this empowerment or desperation? The answer is complex. It was both. The Soviet Union mobilized women because it had to, but it also allowed them into roles that many other armies would not, and once there, they proved effective. War is the ultimate equalizer of survival. Bullets do not discriminate. Cold does not discriminate. Artillery does not discriminate. On the Eastern Front, survival required participation from everyone, and women answered that call. When Americans picture World War II, they often imagine beaches in Normandy, Marines raising a flag on Iwo Jima, or bombers flying in tight formation over Germany. The Eastern Front, by contrast, can feel distant, abstract, almost mythic. Yet it was on that front that the war consumed entire societies. It was there that women entered combat not as an exception, but as a necessity. To understand the women of the Red Army, we have to understand the scale of annihilation they faced. In the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union lost millions of soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions vanished. Equipment was abandoned in chaotic retreats. Cities fell one after another. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. This was not a limited war. It was an existential one. And when survival becomes the only objective, categories that once seemed permanent begin to collapse. Women were not simply allowed into the Red Army, they demanded entry. Recruitment offices in 1941 were flooded with young women insisting on combat roles. Some were turned away at first, but as casualty lists grew longer, resistance weakened. Sniper schools began accepting women in significant numbers. Sniping on the Eastern Front was a war within the war. Unlike mass artillery bombardments or tank offensives, sniping required intimacy. It required patience measured in hours, sometimes days. It required lying motionless in snow while frost formed on eyelashes. It required watching through a scope while the battlefield moved in slow tension. Soviet doctrine valued snipers not only for kills, but for psychological effect. A skilled sniper could freeze an entire sector. Soldiers became afraid to lift their heads above trenches. Officers became hesitant to expose themselves. The battlefield slowed. Women proved exceptionally effective in this role. They were trained to operate in pairs, a shooter and an observer. Camouflage became an art form. They learned to blend into rubble, forests, marshland. They studied how sunlight reflected off rifle scopes. They memorized the rhythm of enemy patrols. Lyudmila Pavlichenko remains the most famous example. But she was not alone. Rosa Shanina, for instance, became known for her ability to eliminate multiple targets in rapid succession. Her diary reveals not propaganda slogans, but exhaustion, frustration, and determination. She wrote about missing her family, about the monotony of waiting, about the constant awareness that she could be killed at any second. Snipers were hunted relentlessly. German units deployed counter-snipers specifically to eliminate them. A duel between snipers could last days. Each side waited for the other to reveal the smallest movement. War at that distance becomes almost surgical. But the Eastern Front was not fought only in forests and trenches. It was fought in the sky. The all-female aviation regiments formed in 1941 became a phenomenon that shocked even their own commanders. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, later designated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, flew Polikarpov PO-2 biplanes made largely of wood and canvas. These aircraft were slow and vulnerable. They lacked armor. They lacked radio in many cases. They lacked advanced navigation equipment. But they possessed something else: audacity. Their tactics exploited the aircraft's limitations. Flying low at night, they cut engines near targets and glided silently. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to track them. Searchlights swept across the sky, but the planes were often too slow to register properly on radar. The German nickname Night Witches reflected both fear and frustration. These pilots flew multiple sorties per night, landing, rearming, taking off again, sometimes 8 or more times before dawn. Their missions targeted supply depots, artillery positions, bridges. Conditions were extreme. Cockpits were open. Winter temperatures at altitude were brutal. Frostbite was common. Fuel lines froze. Engines failed. And yet, they continued. One pilot, Nadezhda Popova, flew over 800 missions during the war. For American audiences accustomed to the image of heavily armed B-17 bombers or sleek P-51 Mustangs, the image of women flying fragile biplanes into anti-aircraft fire challenges assumptions about both gender and technology. Meanwhile, women also served in fighter regiments. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment flew Yakovlev fighters, engaging German aircraft directly. Though less famous than the Night Witches, these units demonstrated that female pilots could operate high-performance aircraft in combat roles. On the ground, women operated anti-aircraft batteries, sometimes engaging German dive bombers at close range. In cities like Stalingrad, urban warfare erased traditional distinctions. Factory workers became defenders. Civilians became combatants. In Stalingrad, women worked in ammunition factories by day and fought in ruins by night. Tank crews, though predominantly male, did include women in certain cases. Some trained as mechanics and drivers, roles requiring technical skill and endurance. Inside a T-34 tank, conditions were punishing. The air was thick with fumes. Temperatures soared during combat. Visibility was limited. War inside a steel hull is claustrophobic and violent. The women who entered those spaces did not enter a softened version of combat. They entered the same chaos, the same terror. It is important, however, not to romanticize this experience. The Red Army was not a progressive utopia. Discipline could be severe. Retreat without orders was punishable. Political officers monitored morale. Fear and patriotism coexisted. Women faced additional burdens. Harassment existed. Skepticism existed. They had to prove themselves constantly. Many cut their hair short. Many adopted harsh, practical demeanors to survive within overwhelmingly male units. And yet, by war's end, thousands had been decorated for bravery. After 1945, their stories became complicated. During the war, propaganda celebrated them as symbols of national unity. After victory, Soviet society shifted emphasis back toward traditional gender roles. Many female veterans found their experiences minimized or forgotten. Some concealed their combat histories in civilian life. Their medals did not always translate into social recognition. In the United States, women's wartime roles were different. The Women's Army Corps, the Waves, and the Wasps performed critical duties, ferrying aircraft, managing logistics, supporting operations. But they were not assigned to frontline combat. The Soviet case remains unique in scale. Nearly 800,000 women served in the Red Army. Tens of thousands were decorated. Thousands died. For American audiences, this raises profound questions. Was this empowerment? Or was it desperation? The answer lies in context. The Soviet Union faced annihilation. Entire regions were occupied. Civilians were massacred. Cities were besieged. The state mobilized every available resource. Women stepped forward not because war was glamorous, but because it was unavoidable. The Eastern Front blurred lines. Factories became fortresses. Villages became battlefields. Teenagers became soldiers. When the Red Army advanced westward in 1944 and 1945, women marched with it, through Poland, into Germany, toward Berlin. They stood in the ruins of cities that symbolized the end of a war that had cost tens of millions of lives. Their presence in those ruins remains one of the most striking images of the Eastern Front. Not because they were women, but because they were soldiers. If we want to understand what it truly meant for women to fight on the Eastern Front, we have to slow down the narrative. We have to leave the large troop movements and sweeping arrows on strategic maps, and instead focus on a single position, a single mission, a single night. Because war is not only statistics, it is moments. Imagine lying motionless in the rubble of a destroyed factory outside Stalingrad in late 1942. The air smells of brick dust and cordite. Snow has begun to fall lightly, but it does not soften the scene. It makes everything sharper. You have been there since before dawn. You cannot move. You cannot cough. You cannot wipe the sweat freezing at your hairline. Through the scope of a Mosin Nagant rifle, you watch a distant window in a shattered building. You have memorized its geometry. You know that German infantry officers often use that second-floor opening to observe troop movements. Hours pass. The Eastern Front was a sniper's environment. Vast distances alternated with claustrophobic urban combat. Women trained for this psychological warfare. Soviet sniper doctrine emphasized counter-sniping, eliminating enemy marksmen to free infantry units from paralysis. Snipers were not independent heroes. They were integrated into infantry strategy. Some female snipers worked in pairs, others in small groups. They rotated positions constantly to avoid detection. They crafted camouflage from local debris, broken doors, fabric scraps, mud. Rosa Shanina wrote in her diary about the unbearable tension of waiting, about seeing enemy soldiers laughing in the distance, about the moment before pulling the trigger, when hesitation could mean death. Sniping required detachment. But the Eastern Front rarely allowed emotional distance. Many of these women had lost homes, parents, siblings. Their villages were gone. Their cities were besieged. For some, the rifle was not only a weapon of war, it was a weapon of revenge. Now shift to the sky. It is 1:30 a.m. somewhere over occupied territory in 1943. The engine of a Polikarpov PO-2 biplane rattles in the darkness. The aircraft is fragile, its wooden frame vibrating in the cold air. The cockpit is open. Wind cuts through heavy flight gear. Inside sit two women, a pilot and a navigator. Below them lies a German supply depot. They are flying low to avoid detection. No radar protection, minimal instrumentation. They navigate by landmarks barely visible in moonlight. Anti-aircraft fire begins. Searchlights sweep across the sky. The pilot throttles back. The engine goes silent. For a few seconds, there is only wind. The aircraft glides. To soldiers below, it sounds like a whisper. Bombs drop. The pilot dives away, engine roaring back to life. Then they circle back to base, land on a dirt strip, rearm, and take off again. They may repeat this 8 times before dawn. Exhaustion becomes normal. Cold becomes constant. Fear becomes background noise. The Germans learned to respect these pilots. They awarded the Iron Cross to soldiers who shot one down. But shooting one down was difficult. The PO-2's slowness, normally a liability, sometimes worked to its advantage. It could stall without catastrophic failure. It could fly at speeds that confused anti-aircraft tracking systems designed for faster aircraft. Still, many were lost. These were not symbolic missions. They were tactical harassment campaigns that disrupted sleep, damaged supplies, and imposed constant psychological strain. Not all women in the Red Army fought in uniformed frontline units. Some fought as partisans behind enemy lines. The partisan war in Belarus and Ukraine was brutal and chaotic. German occupation policies were ruthless. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisals. Civilians were executed for suspected collaboration. Partisan units sabotaged rail lines, ambushed convoys, gathered intelligence. Women served as couriers, scouts, saboteurs, but also as fighters. Moving through forests at night, they planted explosives under railway tracks used to supply German divisions. They carried messages across front lines. They operated radios in hidden forest camps. The partisan war was dangerous in a different way. Capture often meant execution. Women in these units did not have the visibility of decorated snipers or pilots. Their work was quieter, less documented. But it disrupted German logistics on a massive scale. Women were less common in tank crews, but they were present. Tank warfare on the Eastern Front was relentless. Massive armored clashes at Kursk in 1943 involved thousands of tanks. Inside a T-34, the crew operated in a cramped metal shell. Noise was deafening. Visibility limited. Communication often reduced to shouts and hand signals. Some women trained as drivers or mechanics. Mechanical skill was vital. A tank disabled in open terrain could become a coffin. Their presence inside armored units was unusual enough to draw attention, but not unprecedented. War did not pause to accommodate difference. It demanded function. Combat service changed these women. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal a complicated reality. Some spoke of pride, others of numbness. The Eastern Front was characterized by extreme brutality. Cities were reduced to rubble. Civilians starved in sieges. Prisoners were mistreated on both sides. Female soldiers witnessed this directly. Many returned home with medals and trauma. After 1945, the Soviet Union shifted back toward traditional social structures. Marriage and motherhood were emphasized. Some male veterans struggled to accept women who had shared trenches with them. Some female veterans concealed their combat past. History moved forward. Memory became selective. For American audiences, this history is jarring. In the United States during World War II, women served bravely, but not in frontline combat. The Women Air Force service pilots ferried aircraft. The Women's Army Corps managed logistics. Nurses served near battle zones. But official policy barred women from infantry, armor, and sniper roles. The Soviet case stands alone in scale. Nearly 800,000 women served in the Red Army. Thousands saw direct combat. Tens of thousands were decorated. Thousands were killed. This was not symbolic inclusion. It was mass mobilization under existential threat. Was this liberation or desperation? The answer resists simplicity. Soviet ideology had long promoted gender equality in theory, but practical equality in combat emerged because the war demanded it. The German invasion was not a limited conflict. It was a war of annihilation. When survival is at stake, categories collapse. Women entered combat because there were not enough men. But once there, many proved highly capable. And that capability reshaped expectations, at least temporarily. By 1944 and 1945, as the Red Army pushed westward, women marched through liberated and conquered territories. They crossed into Poland. They entered East Prussia. They advanced toward Berlin. When the war ended in May 1945, female soldiers stood in the ruins of the German capital. They had fought from the desperate retreats of 1941 to the final assault. Few American viewers realize how deeply women were embedded in that arc. During the Cold War, narratives diverged. In the West, the Eastern Front was often simplified or overshadowed by Western Allied operations. In the Soviet Union, female soldiers were celebrated publicly, but their personal stories were often compressed into heroic symbolism. Only decades later did diaries, interviews, and memoirs reveal the complexity behind the myth. They were not witches. They were not propaganda posters. They were soldiers. Teenagers who became snipers. Students who became pilots. Daughters who became tank crew members. They fought in the largest war in human history. And they did so in roles that most armies of the time would not have imagined assigning to women. War compresses time. A teenager in 1941 could become a veteran by 1943. A factory worker could become a sniper. A student could become a pilot. For many of the women who entered the Red Army, transformation was not gradual. It was immediate. In 1941, when German forces encircled entire Soviet armies and advanced toward Moscow, evacuation trains carried civilians eastward in chaotic waves. Factories were dismantled and transported beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire cities were mobilized for defense. Women stood in lines to volunteer, while columns of refugees passed them in the opposite direction. Some were accepted immediately. Others were told to return home. Many persisted until the answer changed. Training was rarely comfortable. It was accelerated and severe. Sniper trainees learned anatomy so they would understand where a bullet would incapacitate instantly. They practiced shooting in extreme cold, fingers stiff against metal triggers. They learned how to calculate wind without instruments. They studied camouflage, not as theory, but as survival. An exposed shoulder or glint of light could mean death. Urban warfare in places like Stalingrad erased conventional battle lines. Buildings became fortresses. Sewers became routes of movement. Snipers operated from upper floors, from collapsed walls, from piles of twisted steel. Female snipers were not given separate sectors. They were inserted into the same killing zones as their male counterparts. The psychological dimension of sniping cannot be overstated. It required emotional containment. Many memoirs written decades later describe the first shot not as triumph, but as shock. After that, repetition dulled the sensation. War forces adaptation. The air war carried a different rhythm. The night witches did not experience long, silent waits in rubble. They experienced relentless motion. A single night might involve multiple takeoffs from rough fields illuminated only by minimal lamps shielded from enemy view. Mechanics worked quickly in darkness, loading small bombs under wings while pilots drank hot tea to stay awake. The Polikarpov PO-2 was slow, but its slowness made it maneuverable at low speeds. It could operate from short, improvised airstrips. It consumed little fuel. It was technologically inferior to German fighters, but it was abundant and repairable. German pilots initially dismissed the aircraft as primitive. That changed as losses accumulated and sleep deprivation set in. The constant harassment affected morale. The bombing rarely destroyed massive infrastructure, but it eroded endurance. Female fighter pilots faced even greater scrutiny. They flew Yak fighters in contested airspace. Combat required rapid reflexes, spatial awareness, and precision. They were evaluated not as symbols, but as pilots. Survival in air combat depended on discipline and coordination. Gender did not alter aerodynamics. On the ground, women serving in anti-aircraft batteries engaged dive bombers attacking Soviet cities. These engagements were direct and immediate. Stuka sirens wailed as aircraft descended. Anti-aircraft crews calculated trajectory under pressure. Hits were celebrated briefly before the next attack began. Partisan warfare blurred lines between soldier and civilian. Women carried explosives sewn into clothing. They passed checkpoints with forged documents. They gathered intelligence from occupied towns. Rail sabotage became one of the most effective tools in slowing German supply lines. The partisan movement relied heavily on local knowledge and mobility. Women were indispensable in these networks. Yet war was not simply a theater of heroism. It was attrition. It was hunger. It was frostbite and exhaustion. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. Civilians starved while artillery shelled the city. Women in uniform defended the perimeter while their families endured ration cards measured in grams of bread. When the Red Army began its westward advance in 1943 after Stalingrad and Kursk, momentum shifted. Women marched with units through liberated territories. They saw the aftermath of occupation, burned villages, mass graves, destroyed communities. These encounters reinforced resolve but deepened trauma. In 1944 and 1945, as Soviet forces entered Eastern Europe and then Germany itself, women participated in the final offensives. Artillery barrages shook cities to rubble. Tanks rolled through shattered streets. Snipers cleared buildings room by room. Urban combat in Berlin was brutal and chaotic. Women were present in communications units, medical detachments, artillery crews, and infantry elements. Victory in May 1945 did not immediately resolve what these women had experienced. Demobilization brought a return to civilian expectations. Some veterans spoke openly about their service. Others remained silent. Public recognition existed, but private reintegration was complex. The war had reshaped them in ways that peacetime society did not always understand. For American audiences, the scale remained striking. Nearly 800,000 women served in the Red Army. Thousands fought directly at the front. This was not an isolated experiment. It was systemic mobilization driven by necessity. The comparison with the United States is instructive. American women contributed enormously to the war effort, in factories, in logistics, in aviation ferry commands. But official combat integration did not occur. The Soviet Union crossed that threshold under the pressure of invasion. The question of empowerment versus desperation remains unresolved because it contains both truths. The Soviet state opened combat roles because it faced annihilation. Women entered those roles because survival demanded participation. Once there, many proved effective and capable. Their stories complicate simple narratives of World War II. They challenge assumptions about gender and combat. They reveal how extreme circumstances reshape societies. War on the Eastern Front was total. It did not allow for half measures. It did not allow for protected categories. Women became snipers in frozen ruins. They became pilots in fragile aircraft under anti-aircraft fire. They became partisans, sabotaging rail lines in occupied forests. They became anti-aircraft gunners defending cities. They became tank crew members advancing toward Berlin. They were not symbols on posters. They were individuals navigating fear, duty, loss, and endurance. When the war ended, the world shifted into a new geopolitical reality. The Cold War would later reshape memory, casting former allies into adversaries. But the lived experience of those women remained rooted in a singular truth. They had fought in the largest war in human history and survived its crucible. The Eastern Front demanded everything. They gave it. And history, long told through different lenses, continues to rediscover them not as anomalies, but as integral participants in a war that reshaped the 20th century. War did not ask whether they were ready. It did not pause to measure tradition or expectation. It moved forward with mechanized force, and those caught in its path either adapted or were destroyed. For the women of the Red Army, adaptation meant stepping into roles that had rarely been imagined for them on such a scale. As the Soviet counteroffensives began to gain strength in late 1942 and 1943, the structure of the Red Army stabilized. Training improved. Equipment production surged east of the Urals. Command coordination became more effective. Women who had entered in desperation now operated inside a more disciplined military machine. Their roles did not disappear as the situation improved. They became institutionalized. Sniper schools continued graduating female marksmen well into 1943 and 1944. Some were instructors by then, teaching younger recruits how to move without silhouette, how to read terrain like a map of survival. Veteran snipers understood that patience was not only tactical, but psychological. The goal was not simply to eliminate a target, but to shape behavior. A single hidden rifle could pin down an entire squad, disrupt reconnaissance, slow momentum. On the Eastern Front, where momentum determined survival, that mattered. Cinematic myths often exaggerate sniper duels into theatrical contests. In reality, they were quiet, grinding tests of endurance. Two shooters, separated by rubble or tree line, might wait hours for a mistake measured in millimeters. A breath at the wrong moment, a shadow misjudged. Many such duels were never recorded. They ended with one shot and silence. For female snipers, reputation was double-edged. Their presence sometimes unsettled German troops, who struggled to reconcile expectations with battlefield reality. Yet fame also made them targets. A known sniper became a priority for counter-sniper teams. Surviving long enough to accumulate confirmed kills required both skill and luck. In the air, the tempo intensified as the Red Army advanced west. The night witches operated closer to front lines that shifted rapidly. Temporary airfields were carved out of farmland or forest clearings. Supplies were limited. Maintenance was constant improvisation. Wooden aircraft structures absorbed strain differently than metal fuselages. Mechanics learned to repair fractures under primitive conditions. Fatigue defined these operations. Night flying in open cockpits during Russian winters was physically punishing. Navigational errors could mean crash landings in enemy territory. Yet, sortie counts climbed. For some crews, flying became mechanical repetition. Takeoff, approach, engine cut, glide, release, escape, until the body moved before conscious thought. Meanwhile, female fighter pilots engaged in conventional air combat faced skepticism within their own ranks at first. Performance resolved doubt. Air warfare was unforgiving. Survival rates depended on reaction time, formation discipline, and mutual protection. Skill established credibility more effectively than ideology. On the ground, the vast artillery duels that characterized Eastern Front warfare depended heavily on logistics and coordination. Women served as communications operators, linking forward observers to artillery batteries. In a war where artillery was often called the god of war, those communication lines determined whether barrages were accurate or wasted. Precision reduced friendly casualties and increased offensive momentum. Partisan warfare expanded as Soviet forces regained territory. Female partisans often operated as intelligence collectors. They memorized German troop movements, observed supply routes, and transmitted information through coded channels. Unlike conventional soldiers, partisans existed in a state of permanent vulnerability. Capture could mean execution. Their war lacked front lines. It existed in forests, villages, and rail corridors. As 1944 unfolded, the Red Army launched massive offensives, such as Operation Bagration, which shattered German Army Group Center. Women were present across the support and combat structure of these advances. They marched through territories scarred by occupation. The scale of devastation hardened perspectives. For many, the war had ceased to be abstract defense. It had become retribution and finality. When Soviet troops entered Germany in 1945, the psychological weight shifted again. Combat in East Prussia and Berlin was brutal and close range. Snipers cleared buildings. Artillery pulverized defensive positions. Tank crews advanced street by street. Women embedded within these units experienced the culmination of years of relentless movement, from retreat to counterattack to offensive victory. Victory, however, did not simplify identity. After demobilization, the Soviet Union faced reconstruction. Cities were in ruins. Populations were depleted. The state encouraged stability and rebuilding. Female veterans were often celebrated publicly, yet expected privately to reintegrate quietly. Some returned to education. Others entered industry. Many carried memories that were not easily spoken. Recognition varied. Some received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Others returned with medals, but little acknowledgement beyond their immediate communities. The narrative of wartime heroism was elevated in official memory, yet personal complexity remained beneath that surface. For American observers decades later, the phenomenon invites comparison rather than judgment. The United States mobilized women on an unprecedented scale during World War II, but primarily outside direct ground combat. The Soviet Union mobilized women directly into lethal frontline roles because demographic catastrophe and territorial invasion left no alternative. This distinction reflects circumstance rather than moral hierarchy. War shapes policy. Policy shapes opportunity. Opportunity shapes legacy. By the numbers alone, the presence of women in the Red Army stands as one of the most extensive integrations of women into combat roles prior to the late 20th century. Their participation was not symbolic decoration. It was operational necessity. Yet statistics alone cannot capture their reality. They endured freezing marches across steppe and forest. They loaded artillery shells heavier than their own bodies. They navigated aircraft with minimal instrumentation in blackout skies. They lay motionless in ruins, waiting for a target to expose a fraction of movement. They witnessed cities starve and villages burn. They advanced through landscapes reshaped by mechanized slaughter. And then they returned home. History often compresses such lives into archetypes: the sniper heroine, the night witch pilot, the decorated partisan. But the truth was less theatrical and more human. Many were young. Many were afraid. Many adapted because adaptation was survival. When examining the Eastern Front through a modern lens, it becomes clear that the involvement of women in Soviet combat roles was neither a simple triumph of equality, nor merely an act of desperation. It was the product of a society under existential siege. It was also the product of pre-war structures that had normalized certain levels of female participation in technical and paramilitary training. War accelerated what ideology had suggested, but never fully tested. In the decades after 1945, as Cold War narratives divided former allies into opposing blocs, these stories became filtered through politics. In the West, they were sometimes overlooked. In the Soviet Union, they were sometimes mythologized. Only in later years did historians begin examining diaries, archival documents, and personal testimonies to reconstruct a fuller picture. That picture reveals complexity rather than propaganda. Women in the Red Army were not anomalies. They were participants in a total war that erased conventional boundaries. They fought because their country was invaded. They fought because loss left little room for hesitation. They fought because the state asked, and because many volunteered before being asked. The Eastern Front was a crucible that transformed societies. For the women who entered it as soldiers, pilots, snipers, and partisans, it transformed identity itself. They were not separate from the war's main narrative. They were inside it. And without them, that narrative would be incomplete. If we continue deeper, we must move beyond scale and into the intimate mechanics of survival. Because the Eastern Front was not only vast, it was granular. It was decided not just by armies, but by individuals lying in mud, gripping metal, staring through iron sights or wind-blown goggles. For the women who fought in the Red Army, the war was experienced not as ideology, but as environment. Consider again the sniper. Not the legend, not the poster, but the reality. A female sniper team might deploy before dawn, crawling through frozen ground that cut through uniforms not designed for comfort. They carried rifles, limited ammunition, basic rations, and camouflage that had to adapt to terrain that changed daily with weather and bombardment. The battlefield did not remain static. It churned. Rubble shifted. Snow fell and melted. Smoke altered visibility. Sniping was about patience, but it was also about restraint. Soviet doctrine emphasized confirmed kills. Inflated claims were discouraged because sniper effectiveness was tied to credibility within units. When a sniper eliminated an enemy officer or machine gun position, the surrounding infantry immediately felt the difference. Movement resumed. Confidence returned. But snipers were vulnerable when relocating. German counter-sniper units developed their own tracking methods, watching for muzzle flash or disturbed debris. Female snipers were hunted not because of gender, but because of skill. The duel was clinical. A moment's miscalculation ended it. Air operations carried a different type of exposure. Night Witches crews often described the silence after cutting engines as the most intense moment of flight. Without engine noise, they could hear wind scraping across wings. They could hear anti-aircraft bursts below. They could hear their own breathing. The glide phase lasted seconds, but those seconds stretched. Release the bombs. Restart the engine. Dive away before searchlights locked on. The PO-2 aircraft lacked armor. A single direct hit could ignite fuel or splinter wooden structure. Crews accepted that vulnerability as part of the mission profile. They relied on darkness, repetition, and unpredictability. They became specialists in harassment, not spectacular destruction, but relentless pressure. The German lines at night were rarely fully at rest because of them. On the ground, anti-aircraft batteries often included young women operating rangefinders and shell loaders. Anti-aircraft gunnery demanded coordination. One miscalculated trajectory meant wasted ammunition. In cities like Moscow and Leningrad, these batteries became symbols of urban defense. When German aircraft approached, alarms sounded, and crews moved into rehearsed positions. For many of these women, the war was vertical, always looking up, waiting for the sky to darken with silhouettes. Logistics, often invisible in storytelling, was equally critical. Women operated radios, decoded transmissions, and maintained supply records. In a theater where distances were enormous, communication failures cost lives. A delayed artillery barrage or misrouted reinforcement could collapse an entire sector. The reliability of communication operators, many of them women, ensured that offensives remained coordinated. As the Red Army transitioned from defense to sustained offense in 1943 and 1944, the psychological atmosphere shifted. The urgency of survival gave way to determination for closure. Women who had joined during retreat now advanced through territories once lost. They saw the physical evidence of occupation, destroyed infrastructure, empty villages, civilian graves. That visual confirmation reinforced resolve, but it also deepened emotional complexity. Urban combat in Berlin in 1945 was unlike earlier phases of the war. It was dense, destructive, and personal. Buildings became defensive nodes. Tanks advanced cautiously down narrow streets vulnerable to ambush. Snipers operated across shattered facades. Female soldiers within communications and medical units navigated rubble under fire. The line between front and rear dissolved completely in that environment. Victory, when it arrived, did not feel cinematic. It felt exhausted. The war had lasted nearly 4 years on Soviet soil, Casualty numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens were dead, military and civilian combined. Within that scale were thousands of women who had worn uniforms and carried weapons. Post-war reintegration revealed another layer of complexity. Soviet society faced the enormous task of rebuilding industry, housing, and infrastructure. Women were encouraged to resume civilian roles, though many retained pride in their service. Official ceremonies honored decorated veterans, yet daily life required transition. Some female veterans later described silence in their communities. Their experiences were sometimes misunderstood by civilians who had not served. War had hardened them. It had altered expectations. It had forced them into maturity under fire. Returning to ordinary routines required emotional recalibration. In later decades, memoirs emerged that complicated official narratives. These accounts did not deny bravery. They contextualized it. They described fear alongside courage, doubt alongside resolve. They revealed that heroism was often situational rather than constant. For American audiences, this complexity matters. It prevents oversimplification. The integration of women into Soviet combat roles was not purely ideological triumph, nor purely coercion. It was shaped by pre-war training structures, ideological rhetoric about equality, catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, and the totalizing nature of the conflict. The comparison with the United States during World War II highlights differences in national experience. The continental United States was not invaded. Industrial capacity remained intact. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, but the existential immediacy that defined the Soviet experience did not exist domestically. Policy decisions reflected that difference. In modern perspective, discussions about women in combat often center on standards, integration, and policy evolution. The Soviet experience during World War II stands as an early, large-scale case study, though born from crisis rather than gradual reform. Performance under fire established capability in ways that theoretical debate never could. By the end of the war, women had participated in nearly every function of the Red Army's operational system: sniping, aviation, anti-aircraft defense, partisan warfare, communications, medical evacuation under fire, armored support roles, and logistics coordination. They did not replace men. They supplemented an army stretched to its limits. Their presence did not eliminate the brutality of the Eastern Front. It underscored it. The Eastern Front was a theater where industrialized warfare collided with ideological annihilation. It demanded mobilization beyond precedent. It blurred distinctions between civilian and soldier. It required endurance measured not in weeks, but in winters. Women who entered that crucible were shaped by it. Some were decorated publicly. Some were forgotten privately. All were participants in a war that redefined the 20th century. When historians reconstruct the Eastern Front today, they increasingly incorporate these stories not as footnotes, but as integral threads. The war cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the scale of female participation within the Soviet military system. They were snipers waiting in silence for a target to shift. They were pilots gliding engine off through darkness. They were artillery crew members calculating trajectories under bombardment. They were partisans carrying explosives through forests. They were soldiers in an army fighting for survival. The war ended. The uniforms were folded away. The medals were stored in drawers or displayed in cabinets. Cities rebuilt themselves. Generations passed. But the record remains. Women in the Red Army were not anomalies of propaganda. They were evidence of what total war demands, and of what individuals can become when history compresses choice into necessity. And without their presence, the story of the Eastern Front would not only be incomplete, it would be inaccurate. To continue this story honestly, we have to confront something deeper than tactics, numbers, or even biography. We have to confront scale, and what scale does to human identity. The Eastern Front was not simply a battlefield. It was an environment that consumed categories: age, profession, expectation, All were reshaped under the pressure of survival. For the women who entered the Red Army, war did not merely change daily life. It altered the boundaries of what was considered possible. Many of these women were born in the 1920s. They grew up during industrialization campaigns, collectivization, political upheaval. They were educated in a system that promoted physical training, technical skill, and participation in state building. Shooting clubs were not rare. Aviation circles trained young people in gliding and mechanics. The pre-war Soviet system, for all its contradictions, had normalized a degree of technical competence among women that would later prove critical. When Germany invaded in June 1941, this infrastructure mattered. Women who volunteered often already had familiarity with rifles, navigation, radio operation, or mechanical work. They were not being introduced to entirely foreign domains. They were stepping into expanded versions of skills already learned. But expansion under war is different from expansion in theory. The psychological transformation required was profound. War strips away abstraction. It compresses thought into immediate calculation. Distance, exposure, angle, timing. A sniper cannot afford distraction. A pilot cannot afford hesitation. An anti-aircraft crew cannot afford miscalculation. In memoirs written decades later, female veterans rarely described themselves as symbols. They described routine, cleaning rifles, repairing engines, loading ammunition, waiting. The extraordinary became ordinary through repetition. Cold was a constant adversary. Russian winters did not pause for ideology. Metal froze to skin. Oil thickened. Breath crystallized inside scarves. Those flying open cockpit aircraft wrapped themselves in layers, yet frost still formed along instrument panels. Those lying in sniper positions developed methods to reduce visible breath in freezing air. Adaptation was not heroic. It was necessary. Hunger, too, shaped experience. Supply lines fluctuated. Frontline rations were not always consistent. Women endured the same shortages as men. There were no separate conditions. The front did not provide accommodations. The social dynamic within units evolved over time. Early skepticism from male soldiers often diminished as competence became visible. War has a harsh meritocracy. Survival overrides prejudice. In environments where trust determines whether one lives or dies, performance matters more than expectation. Yet challenges remained. Physical endurance was demanded equally. Marches across mud-soaked terrain stretched for miles. Equipment was heavy. Artillery shells weighed what they weighed. Rifles had no lighter version. Tanks had no expanded space. The environment did not adjust itself to gender. Combat fatigue accumulated quietly. The Eastern Front was characterized by prolonged exposure. There were no short rotations home. There was continuity of violence. The psychological burden of witnessing destruction, civilian suffering, burned villages, mass casualties, pressed inward over years. And yet, within that environment, agency persisted. Many women did not describe themselves as victims of circumstance. They described decision. The decision to volunteer. The decision to remain. The decision to continue after injury. In 1943, after the decisive victory at Kursk, the Red Army began sustained strategic offensives that would not stop until Berlin. Women advanced westward with those formations. They crossed rivers under artillery fire. They established communications lines across newly liberated zones. They assisted in clearing urban pockets of resistance. As Soviet troops entered Poland and later Germany, the moral terrain grew complicated. War does not end cleanly when armies cross borders. Discipline, vengeance, fatigue, and triumph intersected. Women within the Red Army witnessed these dynamics alongside male soldiers. They were not isolated from the moral ambiguities of final victory. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the symbolic center of the conflict collapsed. For female soldiers who had entered the war during retreat, Standing in the capital of the aggressor marked a complete arc. But celebration was restrained by exhaustion. Years of attrition had thinned ranks. Victory carried the weight of absence. Friends and comrades who had not survived to see it. Demobilization followed gradually. Some women remained in service briefly. Others returned to civilian life almost immediately. Reconstruction demanded labor. Cities needed rebuilding. Industry required manpower and technical skill. Post-war Soviet narratives celebrated heroism collectively. Individual stories often blended into larger myths of national endurance. Only later did more intimate accounts surface, revealing the nuance behind official memory. For American audiences today, these stories invite reflection rather than comparison. The United States experienced World War II differently. The homeland was not overrun. Industrial mobilization was vast, but geographically secure. Women entered factories and support roles in unprecedented numbers, laying groundwork for long-term social change. But the immediacy of invasion that drove Soviet combat integration did not shape American policy. The Soviet experience demonstrates how extreme threat reshapes societal norms rapidly. It does not provide a template so much as a case study in adaptation under existential pressure. The presence of women in the Red Army also complicates simplified images of the Eastern Front as exclusively male. Archival photographs show women in winter uniforms, rifles slung across shoulders, aircraft wings behind them, artillery positions carved into snow. These images were once filtered through propaganda lenses. Today, they are re-examined as historical evidence of structural mobilization. Numbers alone cannot explain impact. 800,000 women served. But behind that figure were individuals navigating fear and competence simultaneously. Some were decorated with the highest honors. Others served quietly in roles essential to operational success. Their integration did not eliminate inequality in Soviet society. It did not create permanent structural parity. But it demonstrated capacity under fire, a reality recorded in battle reports, confirmed kill logs, sortie counts, and award citations. As historians continue to explore archival material, patterns emerge. Female snipers often displayed high accuracy rates. Night bomber regiments achieved remarkable sortie totals despite outdated equipment. Communications reliability in mixed-gender units did not differ measurably from male-only units. Performance, documented repeatedly, challenges preconceptions shaped by peacetime assumptions. The Eastern Front was merciless. It was industrialized warfare layered over ideological extremity. It demanded mobilization at a level rarely seen in modern history. Women answered that demand. They did not reshape the war alone, but they were embedded within its machinery. Their rifles fired in ruined factories. Their engines cut to silence over darkened supply lines. Their hands loaded shells beneath collapsing skies. And when the war ended, they returned not as anomalies, but as veterans. Time moved forward. Political alliances shifted. Narratives evolved. But the historical record remains clear. Women in the Red Army were participants in one of the most consequential military campaigns in human history. Their story is not an appendix to the Eastern Front. It is part of its structure. To complete this story fully, we must move into the realm where memory and myth begin to separate. Because every war produces legends, and legends are often cleaner than reality. The women of the Red Army were turned into symbols during the war. Brave snipers, fearless pilots, unbreakable defenders of the motherland. But history becomes more powerful when we examine what stood behind those symbols. Take the sniper duel often dramatized in Stalingrad. In reality, such duels were rarely theatrical. They were long stretches of stillness, interrupted by seconds of irreversible decision. A female sniper might spend 2 days observing a German machine gun nest, noting patterns of exposure. She would study when a helmet appeared in a shattered window, when a shadow crossed a broken wall. Patience was her greatest weapon. Fatigue was her enemy. Hunger, thirst, and cold were constant companions. The duel did not end with applause. It ended with a single rifle crack and a body falling out of sight. After that, she relocated immediately, because a second sniper might already be watching. Now imagine a Night Witch's crew in early 1944, flying over Crimea. It is past midnight. Snow clouds obscure parts of the sky. Their small biplane shakes violently in turbulence. Anti-aircraft tracers rise like fiery ladders. The navigator shouts coordinates over engine noise. The pilot lowers altitude to avoid searchlights. At the target, the engine is cut. The aircraft becomes a glider, descending silently. The pilot feels the air resistance change. The navigator releases bombs. For a fraction of a second there is stillness. Then explosions bloom below. The engine restarts with difficulty in freezing air. If it fails, they will not glide home. They make it back. They land. Mechanics rush forward, refuel, reload. No dramatic speech, just exhaustion and another takeoff. In artillery units, women worked under barrages that shook the earth. Artillery on the Eastern Front was not occasional. It was overwhelming. Shelling lasted hours. The air itself vibrated. Women loading shells had to maintain rhythm under concussion shock. Mistakes meant misfires or casualties. In communications bunkers, radio operators maintained lines while buildings collapsed around them. When cables were cut by shellfire, someone had to crawl out and reconnect them. These were not exceptional days. They were routine. As the Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe, female soldiers encountered civilian populations devastated by occupation. Some women who had joined the war in 1941 as students were now hardened veterans, entering foreign cities with rifles slung over shoulders. They had crossed thousands of miles of battlefield. They had watched comrades fall. They had endured winters and offensives and retreats. Victory in Berlin was decisive but not cinematic. It was rubble and smoke. It was tanks grinding through collapsed streets. It was snipers clearing upper floors of shattered buildings. It was artillery flattening resistance block by block. Women served as medics, dragging wounded through debris. They served as radio operators, directing units through the maze of destruction. When the Reichstag fell and the war in Europe ended, the transition was abrupt. Celebration existed, but it was muted by loss. Nearly every family had lost someone. Among female veterans, the shift from soldier to civilian was disorienting. Some married quickly, encouraged to rebuild family life. Some pursued education, interrupted by war. Some returned to industrial work. Public recognition was selective. A few became decorated heroines whose stories appeared in textbooks. Others faded into ordinary anonymity. Many spoke later about silence. They were proud of service, yet reluctant to recount specific memories. War had not been cinematic for them. It had been physical and immediate. The smell of fuel, the weight of rifles, the sound of incoming shells. These details did not translate easily into peacetime conversation. For decades, Cold War politics filtered how these stories were told outside the Soviet Union. In the West, narratives of World War II often focused on the Western Front and Pacific Theater. The scale of female participation in Soviet combat remained less understood. When mentioned, it was sometimes treated as an anomaly or curiosity. But as archival research expanded and veterans' testimonies were recorded, a clearer picture emerged. Women in the Red Army were not isolated exceptions. They were part of systemic mobilization shaped by existential threat. Statistics reinforce this. Hundreds of thousands served. Thousands were decorated. Thousands were killed or wounded. Female sniper schools graduated significant numbers of trained marksmen. Night bomber regiments flew tens of thousands of sorties. Communications units staffed by women operated continuously during major offensives. Performance reports from the era did not categorize effectiveness by gender in combat zones. They measured outcomes, and outcomes demonstrated capability. The question often asked by modern observers, was this equality, oversimplifies the context. Equality in theory did not erase hardship. Opportunity did not eliminate discrimination. But capability under fire was demonstrated repeatedly. The Eastern Front forced a society to mobilize beyond conventional boundaries. When survival is at stake, rigid categories become luxuries. Women stepped into roles because the alternative was defeat. Their participation did not redefine gender norms permanently in the Soviet Union. After the war, many traditional expectations returned. Yet the historical fact remained. In one of the most destructive wars in human history, women fought in direct combat on a massive scale. For American audiences today, this history invites comparison without distortion. It does not diminish the contributions of American women during World War II. It highlights a different national experience shaped by invasion and catastrophic loss. The women of the Red Army did not enter war seeking transformation of social theory. They entered because their country was under attack. They became snipers because rifles were needed. They became pilots because aircraft required crews. They became anti-aircraft gunners because cities needed defense. War compressed their youth into discipline. It hardened skills quickly. It demanded endurance beyond expectation. When historians now reconstruct the Eastern Front, they do so with greater awareness that the battlefield was not exclusively male. Women were present in trenches, cockpits, bunkers, forests, and armored vehicles. Their presence did not soften war. It revealed its totality. The legacy of those women lives not only in medals or monuments, but in archival records, in photographs of winter uniforms and wooden aircraft, in diaries describing cold nights and endless waiting. They were not myths. They were not propaganda abstractions. They were soldiers shaped by necessity. And in the vast landscape of the Eastern Front, where millions fought and fell, their footprints remain embedded in the snow and rubble of history. In November 1941, the German army was approaching Moscow. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June, had already shattered much of the Soviet western frontier. Entire armies had been encircled. Millions were dead or captured. By late autumn, German forces were within striking distance of the Soviet capital. The Soviet leadership faced a desperate situation. Moscow was preparing for siege. Factories were being evacuated eastward. Defensive lines were constructed in haste. Temperatures were dropping. The first severe frosts had arrived. In this atmosphere of crisis, the Soviet command authorized aggressive partisan and sabotage operations behind German lines. One of the young volunteers selected for such operations was Zoya Anatolyevna Kosmodemyanskaya. She was 18 years old. Born in 1923 into a family of teachers, Zoya grew up during a period of intense ideological education. She was a member of the Komsomol, the communist youth organization. Her upbringing emphasized duty, discipline, and loyalty to the state. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, she, like many young people, sought to serve. In October 1941, she volunteered for a special unit organized by Soviet intelligence and military authorities. These were not regular army formations. They were sabotage detachments trained for operations in occupied territories near Moscow. The unit's mission was harsh and controversial. Under orders tied to Soviet scorched earth strategy, these detachments were instructed to destroy infrastructure that could benefit advancing German forces, including barns, supply depots, and sometimes houses being used by German troops. In November 1941, Zoya was assigned to a small group sent into the area near the village of Petrishevo, west of Moscow. Their objective was to burn buildings used by German units for shelter and storage. Winter had already set in. German troops were occupying villages to escape the cold. Destroying heated quarters would increase their suffering and complicate logistics. Zoya carried incendiary materials. On the night of November 27th to 28th, 1941, she attempted to set fire to structures in Petrishevo. Accounts vary in minor details, but the core sequence is consistent. She successfully set at least one building on fire. However, during a subsequent attempt, she was captured. German soldiers, reportedly alerted by villagers or patrols, apprehended her before she could escape. She was interrogated. Her real name was not immediately known. She gave the name Tanya. Reports from witnesses described that she was beaten severely during interrogation. The Germans sought information about her unit and other partisans operating nearby. She did not provide information. On November 29, 1941, Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya was publicly executed by hanging in Petryshevo. German forces assembled villagers and forced them to watch. Before her execution, according to later Soviet accounts, she addressed the crowd and declared that the Soviet Union would prevail and that Germany would be defeated. The exact wording of her final statement has been debated by historians, as it was recorded after the fact and shaped by wartime reporting. But there is no dispute that she was executed publicly at age 18. Her body was left hanging for some time as a warning to others. When Soviet forces recaptured the area weeks later, journalists documented her story. One of the first major articles about her was published in January 1942 in the Soviet newspaper Pravda. The article turned her into a national symbol of resistance. In February 1942, she became the first woman awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union during the war. Her story spread rapidly. In a moment when Soviet morale was fragile, her execution was framed as evidence of courage under torture and refusal to betray comrades. For the Soviet state, she became more than an individual. She became a symbol. For modern historians, however, the story is more layered. The mission she participated in, burning occupied structures, was part of a scorched earth directive that sometimes placed civilians in complex and dangerous situations. Some villagers suffered consequences for sabotage actions carried out nearby. This complicates the narrative. She was not operating in isolation. She was part of a brutal partisan war in which retaliation was common and civilians were often trapped between forces. German anti-partisan operations were ruthless. Public executions were intended to deter resistance. Zoya's capture and execution were part of that pattern. What makes her story stand out is her age, her refusal to give information, and the timing during the most critical phase of the Battle of Moscow. Her death coincided with the moment when the Red Army began stabilizing the front and preparing its winter counteroffensive. Symbolically, she represented defiance during near collapse. In the decades that followed, her image was institutionalized in Soviet education. Schools were named after her. Monuments were erected. Her biography was included in textbooks. During the Cold War, Western observers often viewed her story through the lens of propaganda. But stripping away myth does not erase fact. An 18-year-old sabotage operative was captured and publicly executed after refusing to betray her unit. That remains. The broader historical question is not whether she was courageous. By most definitions, enduring interrogation without betrayal qualifies. The question is how states transform individual acts into collective memory. Zoya Kozmodemyanskaya became one of the earliest martyr figures of the Soviet war narrative. For American audiences, her story fits into a wider pattern of resistance figures during World War II. Young individuals operating in occupied territory, captured, executed, later remembered as symbols. Yet her story also reveals the severity of the Eastern Front. This was not a distant expeditionary war. It was a war fought in villages, farms, and frozen fields where occupation and retaliation occurred daily. Zoya was not a sniper. She was not a pilot. She was a sabotage operative in a desperate defensive campaign. Her life lasted 18 years. Whether viewed as hero, martyr, or tragic product of total war, her story remains one of the starkest examples of how World War II reached into the lives of teenagers and forced them into decisions with irreversible consequences. In 1943, the Eastern Front had already consumed millions of lives. The German invasion of the Soviet Union had begun 2 years earlier with staggering speed and brutality. Entire Soviet armies were destroyed in the first months of the war. Cities were besieged. Villages vanished. By the winter of 1942 to 43, the tide had begun to turn after the Battle of Stalingrad, but the cost had been catastrophic. The Red Army needed trained soldiers. It needed discipline. It needed skill. It needed endurance. And among those who stepped forward was a young woman from Kazakhstan, Aliya Moldagyulova. She was born in 1925 in what is now Western Kazakhstan. Her childhood was marked by hardship. After losing her mother at a young age, she was raised by relatives and later moved to Leningrad. There, she attended school and developed a reputation for seriousness and determination. When Germany invaded in 1941, Leningrad would soon be encircled. The siege would last 872 days and kill over 1 million civilians. Aliyah was evacuated from the city during the early phase of the blockade, but the experience of displacement left a deep impression. In 1942, at just 17 years old, she volunteered for the Red Army. She was accepted into the Central Women's Sniper Training School near Moscow, a rigorous program established to train female snipers for frontline deployment. The Soviet command had learned that snipers could play a decisive role in slowing enemy movement and targeting officers and machine gun crews. Women, commanders believed, often demonstrated patience and precision well suited to this form of warfare. Training was severe. Recruits learned camouflage, marksmanship, reconnaissance, and survival under extreme weather conditions. They crawled through mud and snow for hours. They practiced remaining motionless while insects crawled across their faces. They studied how to read terrain and anticipate enemy exposure patterns. Aliyah completed the program in 1943 and was assigned to the 54th Separate Rifle Brigade of the 22nd Army, operating on the Northwestern Front. By then, the war had entered a new phase. The Red Army was pushing westward after the victory at Kursk, but the fighting remained ferocious. Defensive German positions were fortified, and counterattacks were frequent. Aliyah was deployed as a frontline sniper. Unlike cinematic portrayals, sniper warfare on the Eastern Front was not romantic or theatrical. It was cold, methodical, and exhausting. A sniper's day often involved hours of stillness broken by seconds of violence. The terrain in the northwestern sectors, forests, swamps, frozen ground, made movement difficult and concealment critical. Aliyah quickly gained a reputation for calm precision. According to Soviet military records, she accumulated dozens of confirmed kills during her service. Exact numbers vary in different sources. Some report around 78 confirmed kills. But what is consistent is that she was recognized within her unit as highly effective. Snipers were not isolated heroes. They were integrated into infantry operations. Before an assault, snipers would target machine gun nests, observation posts, or enemy officers. Their role was to disrupt command and reduce resistance before the main attack advanced. In January 1944, her unit participated in offensive operations near the Pskov region, in the area around the village of Kazachika. These were part of broader Soviet efforts to push German forces out of occupied territories following the lifting of the siege of Leningrad. On January 14, 1944, her brigade launched an assault against fortified German positions. The battle was intense and close range. German defensive lines were deeply entrenched. Snow covered the ground. Visibility was limited. Artillery bombardments shook the terrain before infantry units advanced. During the attack, Aliyah reportedly continued to fire on German positions, supporting her unit's forward movement. At some point in the fighting, she was wounded. Accounts differ slightly in sequence, but the consistent version is this. Despite being wounded, she continued advancing with her unit during a bayonet charge against German trenches. In the chaos of close combat, she was struck again, either by gunfire or shrapnel, and sustained fatal injuries. Unlike Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, Aliyah was not captured and executed. She died in direct combat. She was 18 years old. Her body was later recovered, and she was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, one of the highest military honors. Her story became widely known across the Soviet Union, particularly in Kazakhstan, where she became a national symbol of wartime sacrifice. But behind the official recognition lies a stark reality. Aliyah Moldagulova was a teenager who entered sniper school in the midst of total war. She operated in one of the most brutal theaters of combat in modern history. She fought in freezing forests and trench systems against a determined enemy. She was wounded, continued fighting, and died during an assault. There was no spectacle in her death, no public execution, no staged martyrdom, just battlefield violence. For American audiences, her story offers a point of comparison. In the United States during World War II, women were not assigned to frontline sniper roles. They served with distinction in aviation support, communications, logistics, and nursing, but not in infantry assault operations. The Soviet Union, under the pressure of catastrophic losses, integrated women into direct combat roles on a scale unmatched by other major powers at the time. Aaliyah's life reflects that reality. She was not driven by cinematic heroism. She was shaped by a society at war for survival. Her participation in sniper operations was part of a broader strategic doctrine that valued precision and psychological disruption. Her death occurred during offensive operations that would eventually push German forces westward and contribute to the final collapse of the Third Reich. In Kazakhstan today, schools and streets bear her name. Monuments stand in her memory. Her image appears in textbooks. But beyond symbolism, the essential fact remains. An 18-year-old sniper fought in one of the largest land wars in history and died in combat during an assault on entrenched enemy positions. Her story is not separate from the larger history of the Eastern Front. It is embedded within it.